Hello, I'm Channa Daswatte. I'm at Lunuganga, Geoffrey Bawa's garden estate, which for 50 years of his life he used as a kind of crucible for experimenting with some of his design ideas through his long and distinguished career. What we will do is to walk around the garden and try and understand some of the stories associated with it, the places and people who are around and associated with the garden, and also to look at some of the things that went on to inspire him in many of his buildings. We're now standing in the entrance court of the garden. Geoffrey Bawa would arrive for weekends into this garden, and occasionally his old Rolls Royce would be parked under this overhanging roof. The building that you see is a very interesting building because it's called the Glass Room, and one of the many accommodations that were part of this estate so that he could entertain his friends and enjoy weekends with them. The larger awning is essentially the carport, where occasionally some of his cars would be parked when he came for the weekend. Around here you begin to see the entrance, what was the driver's quarters, which is now the visitor welcome area, and one of the significant objects that you see in this particular space is this incredibly beautiful copper urn in which old fishing nets used to be kept in brine so that the cotton nets would not disintegrate. We have this rather beautiful bird cage chandelier that Bawa had invented for one of his projects. And we are now outside the garden room, and you can begin to see the gravel and cement steps, cement blocks becoming black and white floors within the garden room itself. This is a pretty unique room in that it seems to have got all its proportions from this wonderful shop front that we saw earlier in the entrance court, but where Bawa has used the shop front by inserting glass into each of the little wooden panels that he's removed from the shop front so that he could create a little bay window kind of sitting area, but reused the timber panels above in a wonderful balustrade that you see surrounding a space that looks down into the main space of the Sanalla. It's skylit, so there's a wonderful light that falls on this magnificent table. The coffee table here was something that was designed by Geoffrey Bawa for the Bentota Beach Hotel. Covering the switches that control the lighting in this room is a painting by Ivan Peris, and a whole series of artifacts that Bawa has collected over the years, including this wonderful 19th century railway station bench and this 19th century veranda chair that he rather enjoyed reworking also for the Bentota Beach Hotel in the 1960s. Another favorite piece of furniture is found in this room, which is this love chair or partner's chair, where you can sit looking into each other's eyes, I suppose, if you sat off a evening chatting away into the night. Other artifacts in the garden room include this wonderful 18th century statue of the Buddha, and juxtaposed right next to it, just as Bawa would do, is his beautiful contemporary or modern sculpture of Shiva on his bull by the Indian artist Nanda Gopal, who worked in the Cholamandalam artist village. The garden room has its own histories. In this room, Bawa once met the president of Sri Lanka, Chandrika Bandaranaike, to show her the designs for a new house that was being designed for the president, an official residence right next to Parliament. Looking out of this wonderful room, you see the Red Terrace, and from the Red Terrace, which was a favorite place for dining for Geoffrey Bawa, you also have a wonderful view of Lunuganga, or the Salt River, that surrounds this estate and gives it its name, overlooking which was one of Bawa's favorite dining spaces. The Red Terrace is surrounded by a series of interesting buildings. First amongst them is this very, very interesting chicken coop. If you look at it very closely, it represents some of the ideas that eventually find its way to the Parliament building, which he built a little after this chicken coop was built. And walking past them, we arrive at the edge of the Red Terrace, which has this magnificent view over one of the last bits of the garden that Geoffrey Bawa sort of modified, which is the water garden. And sitting at this corner was really one of his favorite lunch places, at this desk that is made out of leaf impressions in concrete, and looking down on a verdant landscape of paddy fields and lake beyond. These terraces are a whole series of wonderful terraces cut into the hill overlooking the water garden, and holds the Red Terrace and the main house up. And you walk along these terraces to get down to the water garden itself. Walking past the endless sweeping that goes on in this garden to make sure that it's maintained in its pristine and prime condition, we come to the water garden itself. End of the water garden is marked by what is known here as the Black Pavilion. It's a series of old doors that have been placed at the back of a pavilion, which is really to provide shade, and is made of metal arches that have been tied with bamboo over it. That gives a wonderful sort of soft shade. The view from the Black Pavilion provides a wonderful panorama of various aspects of the lower part of the garden. Right ahead is what Geoffrey Bawa used to call the Broad Walk, that forms a kind of base to the walks around the garden. Looking across the wilderness of the marsh, you begin to notice the silhouette of a little leopard that is seated at the water gate, wonderfully sort of silhouetted against a strip of water, carefully made by the architect to be noticed, although it's far, far away and it's quite little. Here we see the little sculpture that in many ways of a dog that was done by Geoffrey Bawa's friend Nihal Amarasinghe out of car parts, and the nose of this little dog is supposed to have marked the time on this interestingly shaped sundial. Of course, it could only be used during the winter months, because in this part of the world, of course, the sun travels north of us and south of us, and when it traveled north, you could hardly see the time on a one-sided sundial. We are now walking down the broad walk of this garden, which takes you from east to west at the base of the high mound on which the main house sits. And on the right hand side we come across this wonderful patchwork of vegetation, paddy, other sort of ferns that you see in the distance, and the edge of the land marked by the hand of man in many ways by what appears to be a ruined classical fence. The little munia, as you see on the paddy, shows the paddy is ripening in one of the plots at Lunuganga, and the plot overlooks the lake, with the water gate marked by the leopard that we saw earlier from the Black Pavilion. So this is called the Scala Danesi, after the Danish partner that Geoffrey Bawa had in Ulrich Plesner. And it appears that the two of them made this garden, made this staircase to take you from the middle walk, which is partway up the hill between the main house and the broad walk, so that one could come down to the water gate at very short notice. I'm now sitting in the company of the leopard at the water garden. Geoffrey Bawa once said he had hoped to see the barge of the Doge of Venice come floating past on a visit to have tea with him. The square concrete patterns mark a hand of man on the water gate, and the twisted and turned branches of jamun trees, or the syzygium plants, are taken as part of the landscape of this section of the garden. This particular plant likes to grow quite close to water and takes on the air of an ancient tree rather quickly. And in this particular example, we see this lovely sort of sculpture of almost a wayside lingam shrine placed under what appears to be an ancient tree. In fact, it is an ancient tree, at least 80 years old. Coming round the corner from the broad walk, one is confronted with another long vista that leads you to what is essentially called the Plain of Jars. And it's also the place where you see quite a few of the ancient rubber trees that was part of this garden. Bawa likes to remember that when he first came out here, bought the rubber plantation and promptly started chopping the trees, he could see a whole lot of villagers coming along and kind of peering through the bushes and saying, well, perhaps he's an all right man after all. He seems terribly eccentric to be chopping up what was essentially a well-cultivated and a well-harvested rubber plantation. And here I'm going to go up this wonderful flight of steps with a cycas above me and beautiful peacock ferns on my right, and come to what is known as the Blue Pavilion. Blue Pavilion simply because the two columns and the window that Bawa used to make up this pavilion was simply blue in the ancient style when he bought it. And of course you can see he has fashioned an interesting little seat from which to look out and contemplate the garden, or the Plain of Jars as he called it, from this little setting. And looking down on the Plain of Jars, you see the well which supplies the water for the estate, and as is traditional, a Terminalia Arjuna or kumbuk tree has been planted at the well, because tradition has it that the roots of the kumbuk tree tend to purify water. And here of course we do have brackish water, and for a long time the purity of the water depended on the ancient kumbuk tree. And of course, going into the forest from here, which perhaps was the lair of centaurs and leopards, we also come across these quite interesting trees which are called Daswatte trees, and they're supposed to have originated with these prop roots because they were originally a marsh plant or a mangrove that kind of migrated back into dry land, and with it took its interesting idea of a system of prop roots, and here you begin to see more of them. And Geoffrey Bawa was quite fond of these trees exactly because of this kind of ancient looking nature that they carried amongst themselves. And this footpath leads us past the formerly planted cinnamon, now many of them having been felled by the various monsoonal winds that often affect this garden. Walking through the forest, one emerges here on the cinnamon hill of the estate. The cinnamon hill is also the place where Geoffrey Bawa built his one last building in the garden. In the mid-90s, he built what was known as the Cinnamon Hill House. The Cinnamon Hill House was essentially on the foundations where the open loggia stands of a workshop in which Laki Senanaika, Geoffrey Bawa's erstwhile assistant and then friend and artist, created a magnificent sculpture for the Sri Lanka Pavilion of Expo 70 in Osaka, which was a large bow leaf that looked like a Bodhi tree. It was made in a pavilion on this location, and today it is the open loggia of a 2-bedroomed cottage that was built on the southern end of the estate. The view from the Cinnamon Hill, of course, is out towards the other side of the lake that surrounds this peninsula, and across the lake you see the residence of two of Bawa's friends, Rico and Hugo, who used to live here in the 1970s, 80s and well into the 2000s. And they too were inspired by Bawa to create their own wonderful garden on the other side. The Cinnamon Hill, of course, is essentially a very, very large lawn which forms one of the key vistas of this garden. We also see a couple of interesting buildings here. One is this water tank, which used to have water pumped onto it from a windmill at the bottom of this hill. And across from this water tank is a drinking trough for cattle. Once again, part of the 1970s need to show that this was a farming estate. Geoffrey Bawa created this wonderful little folly, which is essentially a drinking trough for cows, and water from the first tank that we saw would be pumped onto or into this tank that was held on 4 wonderful columns, and it would slowly trickle into the plant trough that you see as a long line at the bottom of that building. And walking to the center of the hill, we begin to see another sort of lawn much beyond, and on top of that wonderful lawn is the southern end of the house that was Geoffrey Bawa's home for almost 50 years. The main house of this estate was built in the 1930s, and Geoffrey Bawa managed to bring a whole lot of people who were interested or not interested in this house into some kind of satisfaction before he was able to actually buy it. And he then promptly went on to sort of change the house. In fact, the main change he made was to change the main entrance from a sort of western entrance to a southern one. And what you see now is a new entrance. What you see in front is the new entrance that he created in 1947 after he built the house. This painting by Lucky Senanayake was inspired by a Greek myth of Achilles, and here you see sort of the murder of Achilles in the war in one of the Trojan Wars. And this painting very interestingly went on to inspire a couple of other works by Lucky Senanayake done for Geoffrey Bawa, and that particularly is the staircase of the lighthouse. You begin to see the same kind of figures, the same sort of figures of war that you see painted on this, repeating itself in this extraordinary staircase that was done for the Lighthouse Hotel. The painting moves you towards a sort of tunnel-like space, and as you walk through the center of this tunnel space, you begin to see on either side the road that has been sunk to keep the view from the main house. And the bridge itself is part of a complex that makes up the gatehouse suite that you see here in front of us. It's one of the 6 suites that you can come and stay in Lunuganga, and the wonderful wrought iron railing that you see used as a kind of prevention for someone falling off the edge when they come out of their room is originally from an old house in Jaffna and also from the Dutch period. You can sort of begin to read a monogram that must have belonged to the original owner of the house that was demolished in the 1960s. We're now walking on to the southern terrace of the house, and in fact it's a terrace from which you enter the house. And in the center of this terrace is the main entrance, changed by Bawa from the original in 1947. And opposite that entrance is also perhaps the most incredible and most significant view that is part of this garden. And that's this long view over the Cinnamon Hill with a pot in the middle distance that then kind of makes you aware of the tiny little stupa that is on the top of that distant hill. It's hard to see in this take, because of the bright haze and sunshine of today. But of an early morning, when Bawa sat at the table here to have breakfast and coffee, the sun shining from the east would hit the side of the stupa and it would be brilliant white. And in many ways, it's one of the most significant landscape views of this part of the world of the 20th century. This image has been taken over and over and over again by so many visitors to this garden and has been discussed by garden designers and writers about gardens and architects innumerable times. But for Geoffrey Bawa, it was simply his morning view over coffee. And it is this view and this sort of beginnings of landscape that made him become an architect. Geoffrey Bawa was originally trained as a lawyer, and it is only after he made these significant views of the garden that he went on to become an architect, because he realized that he quite enjoyed changing and controlling the landscape and felt that it was something that he could do. In fact, he was persuaded by his cousin, who was a French lady, to become an architect and do with other people's money, she said, what you seem to be doing very well with your own. At the very end of the southern terrace, we also see an entrance into a wonderful courtyard. That was the bathroom courtyard that was connected to the main bedroom, which is to the right of here, and overlooking a small flight of steps that takes you down to the lawn is a Roman head of the Emperor Augustus that peers out of its own personal niche. Looking past or back from that view is the main entrance to the house, and through the entrance you begin to see the lake again. So in many ways the house was designed in such a way that you would make a connection between the two sides of the lake across the peninsula. Walking through the main passage of the house, you come across a sort of Romanesque sculpture of a little bishop, and from that passage you arrive into the main sitting room. The chandelier was brought down to Sri Lanka as a housewarming gift by his cousin Georgette, who persuaded him to become an architect. And all the wonderful furniture you see in this room are old Sri Lankan pieces. An Indo-Portuguese settee that you see on the left-hand side. And above it is an interesting sculpture, the Trojan horse, that was made by an Australian sculptor for him. And it basically depicts the armies, the Greek army, jumping out of the belly of the fake gift that had been given to the Trojans. There's an Ivan Peiris over the writing desk, the ebony writing desk, and this extraordinary chair made by some kind of colonial who thought obviously very grandly of himself, made out of the skull of a water buffalo and ebony to obviously make himself very, very important. And on the wall here we also see a wonderful drawing by an Indian artist called Ramanujan, who again Geoffrey Bawa worked with quite a bit. And in this one, the Snake Palace, you begin to see the insides of a snake made to look like a palace with guards all sleeping at every column. Another of the famous views of this place, which is this frangipani tree that has grown in an extraordinary fashion. And you wonder how he might have done it. Yes, he did hang stones and all of that to bring the branches down. But the key to this particular tree is the fact that it's actually two trees. And if you look very, very, very carefully at the trunk, you'll see that there's a sort of split through the middle, and that shows that these were planted as two branches, which of course naturally would begin to grow away from each other, and therefore created this extraordinary plant. And of course this terrace looks over one of the sort of great classic views of this country perhaps, and this part of the world, the view over Dedua Lake, flanked by two 19th century garden sculptures which he had bought in Britain and placed to frame the view of the island that is part of the estate. So ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed that little walk with me through the gardens of Geoffrey Bawa as part of the AD Weekender event, as much as I did sort of talking about it. In fact, it's one of the few times I have recorded myself on many of the thousands of journeys that I would have made through this garden with thousands of guests or hundreds of guests who have come to visit it. So thank you very much for being part of this garden tour with me. And as for me, it's time I have my lime juice and go and rest before some other guests turn up. Thank you, Rohana.